Hello and welcome to another edition of Conversations of the Heart. As always, it's your boy T Tail. We have a special guest, a returning guest. I would love to say friend of the show now, family of the show
Absolutely.
now.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
Jane Johnson Wall. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in prenatal and perinatal loss, motherhood, and all of the good things. We have done an incredible podcast just a little bit ago. And it was incredible that we had to come back. It was so nice. We had to do it twice.
Hmm.
I consider her a doctor. She's not. I
Thank
consider
you.
her a doctor. So it is not the words of Jane Johnson Wall. It is the words of Terrence Tito. I consider her doctor because that's how much information that she has within her brain and in her heart that she pours out to the world. And that's why I say she's a doctor to me. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
But she's awesome at what she does. And she also partners, with the lovely Kelsey for the MotherLoad Collective. And then she has her own practice too, Your Mom Pod. And at the end of this all today, we are going to be discussing because we almost did it the first time, but we wanted to save it for
We
this.
we stopped ourselves.
We stopped ourselves, and we're going to be getting into everything perinatal, going through, perinatal, loss, birth trauma, all of the above, and how that ties into mental health. So, welcome back to the
Thank you
show.
so much. Yay, I'm happy to be here.
Yes, yes. So as we were about to go down a rabbit hole, the first time around, um, and I'm so glad that we did stop so we can actually focus on this subject for this particular show and highlight perinatal loss, birth trauma, and things like that, and how that affects the mental health of mothers and fathers. Um,
Absolutely.
loss is hard for everyone, and so with that said, let's dive right into it. But
Okay.
before we dive in, do you want to say something? Introduce yourself again one more time.
I was
If I
going to say, I
missed
think you,
anything.
no, I was going to say, I think you do a very nice job introducing me. I am a marriage and family therapist, and I've been licensed for 25 years, and I am blessed to love what I do. Um, the fact that one of the things that I love doing is talking to people about perinatal loss and birth trauma seems a little odd to most people, but truly it's something that I'm passionate about. So I
Mhm.
appreciate you creating space for us to be able to have this conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, licensed for 25 years, you don't look no more than 27. I mean, that's
Oh, you're
that's
so
just
kind.
that that is amazing.
Thank you.
So for people who don't know, perinatal, right? Um, sometimes we not, I won't say we, I'll say sometimes my mouth always goes to prenatal, right? It always
Absolutely.
goes to
Absolutely.
prenatal. So if I hiccup a couple of times, it was because my brain says prenatal, right?
Mhm.
Right.
My brain does it too, and I talk about this stuff all day, so no worries.
Uh, but perinatal loss, right? And that is your passion, and your practice is women centered, and that
Yeah.
is an amazing thing. Um, so why perinatal loss and birth trauma? I mean, that's something that it's tough,
Mhm.
and could be draining, right? I think when you talk about because when people think therapists, it's like people think, okay, I can just go dump everything and they're superwoman or superman and nothing affects them. It's like, it's
Mhm.
great, right? But when people really take therapists on and when people actually take on the title of therapist, it's not just people just throwing everything at me and it doesn't affect me. It's just when you hear the stories, it's still heartbreaking. I can imagine.
Oh,
It's still you
absolutely.
still go through things like when you hear things. It's like a doctor that loses a patient or a doctor, right? Who's
Yeah,
it's like yes, that's their job, but sometimes it affects doctors differently. Now, some doctors are just that's just life and we move on. But some doctors that have empathy, it's very different for them.
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
So why take on this big, big um topic, right? When it could be draining for you.
Well, as draining as it could be for me, I think about the families who navigate the loss, and however draining it could be for me is nothing in comparison to how draining it is for them.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, Ultimately, I would, if I could wave my magic wand, I would love to put myself out of business. It would be a perfect world if there was no perinatal loss for families to have to process, right? Like I'd happily find something else to do. But it just kind of revealed itself to me. And I think we talked about this last time that, I had referrals come to me for families who had navigated all kinds of losses related to pregnancy and infants. And it was clear that they didn't have specialists who could support them. And so I became a
Mm.
specialist in response to the need.
Wow. Awesome. Awesome. So, I mean, perinatal loss could be an array of different things,
Yeah.
right? Um, list out the ways that perinatal loss, just for the viewers who may be only familiar with one thing or two things, right?
I was
What
just,
are some of
yeah,
the right, and for the viewers, if it's triggering, then please do what you have to do, right? But
absolutely.
but for the people, right, who do not know, who want to know, what are some of the different things of perinatal loss? Like how does that happen, and what are the different type of ways?
Well, I was just going to say, right, to kind of almost expand the definition of it. So,
Hmm.
infertility, common issue. A lot of people know someone who is navigating through infertility. That falls under the umbrella of perinatal loss. And then we have miscarriage. So, many people are common with miscarriage. And again, it falls under that umbrella.
Mm,
And then we have things like stillbirth, right? That a baby is born um, or dies in utero after 20 weeks gestation. And we also have abortion, which falls under the lens of perinatal loss, but people don't necessarily classify it in that way. And then there's termination for medical reasons, so a late term abortion. And again, people don't always look at it through that same lens. And
mm,
then under the guise of all things perinatal, it is pregnancy up to the first year after birth. And so then infant loss comes into play under the lens of perinatal loss as well.
mm. I think you just taught me something new because
Yeah, that's my goal.
I've heard a few of those things,
Yep.
obviously. But I didn't know infertility landed in that as well.
It does.
I knew most of it, but I didn't know that. So,
Mhm.
well, thank you
Yeah,
for that.
absolutely.
And thinking about it further, I could probably see how now that could be a part of it.
Mhm.
Because of the disappointment and because of all the things that can come with that. But I never thought that part was a part of perinatal loss. But
Mhm.
yes, see, and that's why I call you Doc. So with all, and you mentioned abortion, obviously a hot topic this year.
Hot
Um,
topic this year.
you know, um, now some people would say if you voluntarily go in, how is and take care of things, right?
Mhm.
You know, how would or why would you classify that as perinatal loss? I know in theory it is a loss, right?
Yeah.
But some people might say, not me, but some
Mhm.
people might say, well, why would you classify that as perinatal loss when this person went in and then went in and to go do it, right?
That's exactly what many people say. No, you're
Hmm.
absolutely right. And people reference the idea that you made a choice. And
Correct.
so it is, you made this choice. And so you knew that that's what you wanted to do. So why would you be feeling badly about it, right? Like, why that kind of thing that people view it as being, if this was what you chose, you made this decision, then that's just kind of part of it.
Right.
So and we could go down a whole kind of rabbit hole about abortion and how abortion feels like a choice, but for the majority of people who are accessing abortion, they don't feel like they have a choice. and the idea that everyone who wants or needs an abortion doesn't actually have access to having
Mm,
an abortion.
mm,
Abortion is healthcare, and we know that there are problems within the healthcare system,
mm-hmm,
including people being able to access the healthcare that they need, and that's across the board. People can't
yeah.
get the medications that they need, they can't get in with the specialists that they need, and people who need or want an abortion are not always able to access it.
Mm,
So, to kind of put it under that umbrella, but the bottom line is the majority of people know a woman who has had an abortion. Like, we just need to kind of talk about that,
mm,
that approximately 50% of women of childbearing age have access to abortion,
mm,
and 45% of women who have access to abortion have accessed it more than once.
mm,
So abortion is common. There's a lot
mm-hmm.
of stigma behind it. And so that's why people don't feel like they can openly have the discussion, but abortion is common.
Yes.
And
No, of
then,
course.
right, when
Mm-hmm.
we look at termination for medical reasons falling
Uh-huh.
under the umbrella of abortion,
Mm,
that's a facet that kind of increases what the statistics look like. And
mm,
there's loss with that. There are all kinds of factors that come into play with people needing to have an abortion. And it is not always that it is somehow this unwanted child or unwanted situation.
mm-hmm.
And I think that we forget to really consider that as a society. And so that's something that, Kelsey and I, through our work, are really trying to give a voice to.
Wonderful, wonderful. Um, in your expertise, right? Um, in how many different ways does perinatal loss affect, women? It's tough mentally. It's grief stricken, right? Um, because it's tough, right? I think you never really get over certain things, right? You kind of learn how to navigate heavy waters, right?
Yeah.
Um, they say time heals all, but sometimes I don't know about that. I think sometimes it's as time progresses, we just know how to flow, and we may know how to cope a little bit better. We might be in therapy a little bit more, but the pain is still there. Um,
Well, no matter what, the fabric is different, right? It's like the idea of having a scar, right? When you
hmm
have a cut and it's scabbed over, it's still very vulnerable, but eventually that will scar over. And so it
hmm
doesn't look the same, it doesn't feel the same, but it functions, right?
mm,
When you've got a scar, it's like,
yeah.
it still functions. It just is a bit different. And so I
hmm
think being able to kind of recognize that in general, the goal is for people to be able to integrate losses into their lives, into their identity, so that they
hmm
can move forward,
hmm
but not to expect that it means that things are going to somehow magically go back to what they used to be.
Right, right.
And
Grief it's heavy. Good.
it is heavy. And I was going to say, I think looking through the lens of grief for mothers, right? And I think you and I had talked about this before. When a woman has a positive pregnancy test, she becomes a mother. When a
Yeah.
baby is born, a man becomes a father, or a non-birth parent becomes a parent. But when a mom has a positive pregnancy test, that's when that identity of mom comes into play. And we call that matrescence. And so that is the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual changes that come as a
hmm
result of motherhood. Yeah, matrescence is the term
Mm.
for it. Another
So
little something for you to learn.
absolutely. I'm gonna
Awesome.
rewatch this and probably write that down too. I'm not gonna think about that.
Perfect.
Um, but now for men, when a woman gets a pregnancy test, and yes, mom, the woman because of mom.
Mhm.
Where does that land for men? Where he said, "Oh well, 9 months, that's when he becomes a father, right?"
Yeah,
But all throughout the 9 months, he becomes something more, though. In
absolutely.
essence, I think because now he's taking care of two people,
Yes,
right? He's taking care of even though physically, like, yeah, I can't hold my baby and stuff like that, but he's still providing for, taking care of now because she's eating for two, she's getting bigger. He
Mhm.
has to go with her to classes. He has to be a support right? And some people might say, oh, well, that's a boyfriend duties or husband duties or whatever the case is. But it's still there's extra responsibilities. If you weren't pregnant, we wouldn't be going
Absolutely.
to Lamaze, we wouldn't be going to therapy,
Yeah.
certain things we wouldn't be doing.
Breastfeeding class, all the things. Yeah.
Nothing, right?
Yeah.
So there's still an extra layered sense of responsibility that a man does have, right? To where
Absolutely.
he's like, okay, now what? Okay, pregnant. Okay, so do I need a second job, third job?
That role of
What I got to
provider.
do?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. That gets activated. I think with dad, it's still that the actual baby is still kind of theoretical, right?
Right.
Like, so that role of provider absolutely gets activated.
Yeah.
And that's such a fair thing of what does it look like to be a protector?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It gets very interesting. Like your person gets bigger and you realize you feel it's like you're not looking at them as fragile, but it's like, okay, wait a minute. You're going up them
Oh,
stairs a little bit too fast.
there's
Hold
a
on, pause.
vulnerability. Absolutely. I say that to moms all the time. Like, I see what a badass you are, but let's acknowledge that vulnerability is part of pregnancy.
Hmm. It definitely is. Um, when it comes to though, like the loss of, and it's hard for me to even say prepare because it's hard to prepare for these things and death but what are some things that, and I guess afterwards, right, that
Yeah.
women can do that you would recommend if they have suffered a loss in some way, shape, or form when it comes to perinatal, what can they do? What should they do um, for
Right.
resources?
Yeah. No, I was going to say it's difficult when you realize that because society doesn't talk about this enough.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're looking through the healthcare model of the medical lens, that's what a care team will prepare somebody for, right? Is
Mm,
here's the physical, expectation, here's what you will experience, but there's not really the acknowledgement of the emotional and mental toll.
mm,
And so I feel like there is a bit more recognition of it. Certainly, previous generations had none of that, but
mm,
there is not enough. I feel like sometimes these moms need to almost advocate for themselves. So I think when somebody is navigating through the perinatal process, and I'm a firm believer like you of all things therapy,
mm-hmm.
but to recognize that even just pregnancy is enough of a reason, for lack of a better term, to pursue getting therapy support, but to also then recognize that being able to identify what they need may look different at different times. So a therapist can help with figuring out, would a support group be helpful for you, right? Is that
Mm,
something that you would like? You're looking for that sense of community. Would you rather have books to read or, audiobooks to listen to podcasts? Like, there are all kinds of different avenues available for people. So some
mhm,
of it is just recognizing some people are like, I would love to be part of a group. And other people are like, nope, I'd rather kind of have access to something on my own time schedule.
mm,
And this is part of it, that grief is, as you know, such a unique experience. And so it's hard for people to know what they may want when we're looking at it through the lens of that time period after loss. I would say to people, you want to prioritize basic needs. You want to make sure that you remember to drink water. You want to make sure that you're eating. You want to make sure that you're sleeping. Being able to prioritize those basic needs is a stepping stone in being able to then figure out the higher level needs that are going to come into play.
mm. Thank you
Therapy
for
is
that.
no good to, yeah, no, therapy is no good to someone who is up all night because they can't sleep. We need to prioritize that foundational piece, and then that allows people to cause the hierarchy, but to access the other needs that they have.
Mm, mm. That's powerful. And and when it comes to perinatal loss, right? The family, the friends. Um, of of the parents who have lost, right? What are some things that they should stay away from doing? That's what I want.
Oh, there are so many things. We like how many parts could we do for this? There are so many things.
Come on. Yeah.
Um, the one thing that I try to offer is that the stupid shit that people say is well intentioned, just very misguided.
Mm, mm,
So it can help when you recognize that someone's not trying to be hurtful or dismissive. It is their own relationship to loss that often triggers what they say. So the idea that someone who has, we'll put a few of them together. Somebody who has navigated through IVF and is now pregnant and they have a miscarriage. And the
mm,
fact that people will say, but at least you know you can get pregnant.
mm,
That is not what to say to someone who has just experienced pregnancy loss.
mm, mm,
For people navigating IVF, they often get a lot of unsolicited feedback. Oh, my coworker's cousin's neighbor did X, Y, and Z, and they got pregnant. Or you just need to relax. It'll
mm,
happen.
mhm,
Just those are the things that are not helpful. The most helpful thing that you can do is just leave space. And if you don't know what to say, like literally, to say, I don't know what to say, but I'm sure this is a very difficult time. Like literally, that's all you have to say.
mm, mm. You know,
We have a tendency to want to fix things for people.
I think I've been beating this drum about grief in general, grief and loss,
Yeah.
um, about what things to say, what not to say, what to do, what not to do, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the things that people say are astounding. And you're right, well intentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and sometimes I feel people don't know what to say.
Yeah. Oh,
So
absolutely.
so they just grab the first positive thing that they feel like, oh, they're in a better place.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
How's that help me, sir?
Yep.
Right. They're trying to make you feel better in a place where
Mm-hmm.
you're not feeling better.
They're trying to make themselves feel better. They're
Mm.
uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable. As a society, we need to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. We
Mm-hmm.
don't like that feeling. So we like to fill the void.
Mm. Mm. Filling voids is a big thing for us, um,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to grief, trauma, um, things that we're going through in life. It's how do I how do I avoid this, right? Or what's going to make me feel better, right?
Yeah,
Oh, let me get a second job to avoid the grief. Let me start working on more projects to avoid the grief. Let me just
keep
get
busy.
busy,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah,
So we can avoid grief when sometimes I feel like we need to lean into the grief. Um,
absolutely.
because that's where healing is.
Mhm.
Like the healing is in that part where we lean into, right? And avoidance is a hell of a thing. And avoidance is something where trauma will always remain in avoidance. Grief will always remain
Absolutely.
in avoidance. Um, because at some point it's gonna live rent free somewhere up here. I don't know where it's gonna
Yeah,
live. Back, front, left, right. It's gonna live
yeah.
somewhere there, rent free until
And
you
it'll
address
probably
it.
move around. Yeah, but
Oh
and it'll
yeah.
probably even move around. So
Yeah.
that's the other part of it. And it's true until you address it. And
Mhm.
that idea of keeping busy aligns with kind of our culture productivity.
Yep.
Your value
Mm-hmm.
is based in what you do and what you
Mm-hmm.
produce. And healing feels
Mm.
like you're not doing anything and you don't have
Mm-hmm.
anything to show for it in real time. And so it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
feel productive.
And I think what people also don't understand is achievement is not healing. All right.
Absolutely.
You can achieve. you can make money, you can build. And congratulations on those things. That's all wonderful
Yeah.
things. But doesn't mean that you're healed, right? And sometimes you could outwork yourself into a place where the things that you build cannot sustain because you can no longer sustain
Absolutely.
those things. And
Yeah.
that's why unpacking these traumas and unpacking your stuff is key to
Absolutely.
healing. And that's why I love where it's uncomfortable for me. That's where I lean in because that's the sweet spot. Because the
Hmm.
sooner I lean in there, is the sooner I can get back to life, right? And it
Figure it
may not
out
be the
though.
old
Yeah.
me. It may not be the
Yeah.
old me, but it'll be me, right? I
Hmm.
mean, maybe a better version of me, you know? So
Yeah.
that's where I always try to be is trying to live in the sweet spot. So many people in relationships avoid it's uncomfortable conversation. Families, like, they avoid uncomfortable conversations. And it just
Absolutely.
turns into a cancer almost, right?
Hmm.
And it's just
Yeah.
like we could have saved ourselves years of grief if we would have just had one tough conversation,
Hmm.
right? So I think that's something that I do love that you said is it's just you have to be able to have those conversations,
Hmm.
right? I think that's something that that I truly do believe in. And when it comes to people, right, the people who say things to people, right, what would be just some of your advice besides shut up? But
That's yeah, no, that's kind of it. Um, but to also, I mean, the ideal scenario is for everyone to have a little bit of awareness about what loss brings up for them. So when we're looking at perinatal loss, like Kelsey and I refer to those as being unspeakable losses, that people literally don't have the language for them. We don't
Mhm.
even have a term. If if you're someone who is married and your spouse dies, you are a widow or a widower. If you are someone and your parents die, you are an orphan. If you are a parent who loses a child, we don't have a term for you. There's no way to identify, right? So if someone says you're
Sure.
married, you can say I'm a widow, right? And everybody knows
Yeah.
what that is, and we say, oh, so sorry for your loss and all the things. And don't mean to cheapen it, but right, like that's the protocol. When you say to someone, how many children do you have? It's gonna be a loaded question because someone could have no children because they've never had children.
Yeah.
Somebody, I mean, if you ask me, I have two children and I have two living children, and I had two pregnancies that brought two living children. Not every pregnancy results in a living child. So sometimes when you say to someone, how many children do you have? It's a loaded question of how many children do I have that are
Mm,
living? How many children do I have in total? How many children do I have that are deceased? So
mm.
just recognizing that because we don't have that title, like, wouldn't it be great if somebody could say, here's my reference point, my equivalent to a widow or widower. And so we don't offer that to parents. And so
Mm.
through the lens of society, it's like we need to have some awareness about the fact that that can be such a loaded question.
Wow. And I never really thought about that. Um, what is the term? Um,
We don't have one.
we really don't have one. Oh
We
my,
don't. There
my
there have
goodness.
been there have been and I can't think of it. I think it may be a Swedish term. I can't remember. There
Hmm.
there is someone who was trying to incorporate sort of a term that encompassed it. But the other thing that we acknowledge is it's a loss that is so devastating. It's a loss that is so unique that even if you had a label or a way an identifier, that
Hmm.
it also wouldn't necessarily do it justice.
Yeah,
But
of
it
course.
is a difficult thing, right? To
Yes.
just recognize that we don't offer that as as a way for parents to identify themselves as parents who have lost a child
So, has a parent ever asked you and said, "How do I answer that question?"
all the time,
So
all
what do
the
you
time.
say?
So sometimes I say, well, if you're feeling feisty, we just right like sense of humor is a huge part of grief, and we don't think of sense
Hmm.
of humor as being part of grief, but
Yeah.
it's a huge part.
Hmm.
The example or the visual that I offer to people is a bullseye. So as parents, you are the center of that bullseye, and your closest people share in that center point. And then as you move out from those rings, you have those inner rings. Those are people that you are closer to. Those are the people that you are going to give different responses to. If you're out on the edge ring,
Mm.
you don't owe anybody an explanation. That if somebody says to you, how many children do you have? And you have two living children and you lost a child, you can smile and say two. You can just say two. You could also say three. But just to keep it simple, you could say two because then somebody may say, how old are they? And all of those sorts of
Mm.
things.
Mm.
But it's like looking at it through the lens of you don't owe anybody an explanation. And the challenge that comes up for parents, so any parent who has lost a child, their number one concern is that people are going to forget their child.
Mm. Mm.
And that, right, like that's so impactful.
Wow. Wow.
And so being able for them to kind of find the balance where they want to honor that child, they
Hmm.
want to speak that child into existence.
Mm.
So I just offer to people that not speaking your child into existence in that scenario with somebody who's on one of those outer rings, the cashier at Target, it doesn't do anything to dishonor your child.
Mm.
So it is finding that balance of also recognizing your bandwidth. So some people will say, I have three children, two are living and one is not here. And for some people, that's very easy for them to say that. It takes time, typically, for people to be in a place where they can just have that as the narrative of who they are as a parent.
Mm. Mm. Wow.
It's a loaded question.
Very loaded question. Very
Yeah.
loaded question.
And it's one, when you think about it, it is one that comes up in society like so readily. It's kind of like small talk. Do you have any kids?
Hmm.
Yes. Oh, how many? Right? Like it's just a part that when it also speaks to, particularly for women, how they are viewed as having worth through the role of being a mom.
Oh, yes. Oh, bring it on home.
Oh, here
Yes.
we go.
Because for me, I've always told people to stop asking people, women specifically, when are you going to have kids? Or if you're in the family, when are you going to have my grandbabies? When are you going to have my niece or nephew? Right?
Mhm.
Stop, because you don't know, one, if people are trying. You don't know if
Absolutely.
people are not successful. You don't know if people have miscarried. Um, you don't really know their situation. And
Absolutely.
if you're close to them, they'll let you know.
Yes.
But it's not your business to police or ask, when are they having these kids? Because you know you're getting older, right? 38, 39. You know you're 40. What's going on, right? And even people who are 25, people who have suffered losses young, right? And
Absolutely.
consistent miscarriages over and over and over again. And here you are selfishly. So when are you gonna have my grandbaby? When are you gonna have my niece and nephew and all the things, right? And you don't know how triggering that could be for them. At Thanksgiving dinner, you're
Hmm.
going on eating your turkey and you're asking all these questions, and in the back of their mind, they're feeling
Yeah.
worthless.
Oh, I mean, we know more now, right? Like something like polycystic ovary syndrome, right? We
Mhm.
know that, and because we have better identification, endometriosis, things like that, we have better identification. There's still whole challenges with access to healthcare, but Like these are things that we have more ability to identify them, but they're still not great treatments. So if you have somebody who has endometriosis or, PCOS and
Mm-hmm.
is diagnosed, I don't know, late teens, early 20s, there's still a whole journey that will impact the fertility options available
Mm-hmm.
to them. And it's kind of like people don't owe someone an explanation about their medical diagnosis,
They don't, but they
right?
also feel like, well, this is my mom, this is my aunt, this is my grandmother.
Yeah.
I gotta answer, right? And so I think, when would you say, because, and that's where I think it gets tricky, because it's never with, strangers and stuff. It's always with people that's closest to you,
Closest.
right? Which creates
So,
problems,
well,
right?
I was just going to
Awkwardness.
say, and you would think that the people closest to you would be the people who would understand the best, right? Like the irony right there. I mean, I have little catchphrases that I offer to people that when somebody says, "When are you going to have those babies?" Where you can say, "You know what? I appreciate that you see in me somebody who'd be a great mom." It's hard to give that to somebody when you are activated by
Mm,
the impact of that question. But these are things that we talk about, where it's like, what is it to kind of reflect? I mean, you could also, I guess, say to somebody, it appears as you're telling me I'm not getting any younger. I guess you realize you're not getting any younger either. You may not be invited back for next year's Thanksgiving.
I like that though. No, I like
You may
that.
not be invited back next year,
But I like it.
right?
I
Like
do.
those sorts of things. And it's difficult because in general, and I can't remember if you and I have talked about this before, but in general, looking at this through the lens of young women, the majority of young women actively spend, and I always say no judgment, but spend their mid-teens through probably their mid-20s actively trying to avoid pregnancy, right? The default mode is that you can get pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when people do decide that it's time for them to pursue pregnancy and do family planning, when they experience fertility challenges, it's kind of surprising because again, our assumption has always been that this is something that will be readily available to you. And so you need to take precautions to make sure that it's available to you on the right time, right? On the
Right.
timeline that you're looking for. And so there's a heavy loaded component to that.
Mm, mm, mm. That was always something that was dear to me, about just people have to stop with putting their opinions on you, and
Absolutely.
how do you respond to that, especially when it's your family, it's your mother, it's your grandmother, it's your auntie, it's your cousin, it's people. It's hard because of the lack of boundaries that people feel
Well,
super comfortable with
they
with
feel
you, because a
so
stranger really is
comfortable,
not really gonna just meet you on the street. Hey, so when you gonna have kids? Who cares, right? It's
right? Yeah,
normally the
I was
people
going to say
closest to
sometimes
you.
sometimes they do though. Like sometimes they do. But I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the things, and again, this takes time, right? Like this is stuff that we work on in therapy to be able to look at that auntie and say, I can tell that being a mom has been one of your favorite things. How old were you again? With right, like so you reflect it back, but you have to be in a place where you can recognize that the things that people say to us are reflective of them and their issues, not us.
Mm, that's good. Um, so boundaries. So how do you create that boundary? Right? Right.
Don't go to
With
Thanksgiving dinner.
now you're creating a new problem. That's gonna be a new problem now. Um,
Oh,
that's a tough one. I think, because I think people have hard times creating boundaries in general. And then I think it's even 10 times harder when it's your own family,
yeah.
right? It's
Hmm.
a tough thing. I think people, even couples, it's like I'm gonna create a boundary for you. And I'm gonna create a boundary for you too, right? But then when it comes to your mother, your father, your aunt, your grandmothers, it's like, well, I don't know. They've been there for me all my life, and it's guilt. It's a lot of
Yeah.
guilt,
Yes.
right? It can cause a lot of problems. Um,
It does. So I think that also being able to look at it through the lens, and everybody has different levels of quality relationship, right, with
of
their
course.
parents. And we also know that our biological relatives are not always the extent of our family, that we have chosen family.
Oh yes.
But right, being able to say to that parent, step parent, auntie, grandmother, eh, potentially to have a conversation
Mm-hmm.
before the conversation can come into play,
Mm,
right? So to say, we're getting together. I'm excited to see you on Thanksgiving, right? I'm bringing, whatever apple pie. I heard you're making your whatever yams, whatever sort of thing.
mm-hmm.
And to say, right now, I'm navigating through a difficult time with X, Y, or Z. And so I'd really like to take a break from talking about it on Thanksgiving.
Mm. Okay.
And then when Thanksgiving comes, and it'll come, and somebody will say something because humans are imperfect. We had that whole conversation.
Yes, we did.
Um, you have a reference point where you can say, this is the sort of thing that I was talking about when we
Mm-hmm.
chatted a few weeks ago.
Right. That's good.
Right? Like it is based on, like, we can't control what other people do, right? Like I always
No.
say that it would be a perfect world if we could control what every other person was doing.
Mm-hmm.
But we have the opportunity to make sure that we respond, not react. And so being able to prepare for some of these, situations is helpful. Being
Mm-hmm.
able to prepare other people, right? Like set up that boundary ahead of time can be a helpful thing. And it doesn't guarantee anything, but it then at least offers a reference point for a more direct conversation.
Mm. I do like that. Getting
Okay.
getting ahead of it. Having those tough conversations
Having those and
early.
it's having the tough conversation, but also not, right? Like you're allowed to make it more of an informational, not necessarily like
I
an
like it.
exchange.
Right. And
Because I think
sometimes,
it can be difficult with the idea of that you're opening up the conversation, that
hmm,
somehow people get a vote or get to, and it's like, no, this is informational,
yeah,
not interactive.
that's true. I think because the reason I thought about tough conversation is because for me, when you open up that door of, just going through some, things and I don't want to discuss this. You okay? And I was
Yeah,
like, oh,
right.
you can tell me, I
Yeah.
won't, I won't tell everybody around the
You and
table.
I must be in the same family because yes, I know these conversations,
It's like I won't mention it in front of everybody, but
right?
you and me,
Yeah,
like what
absolutely. Oh,
happened? And you're like,
yeah,
oh yeah, this includes you too. I don't want to talk about this with you either. Okay. Sometimes people have to learn how to respect boundaries. Um, and I think sometimes causes a lot of problems and a lot of grief within
yeah. Grief,
families and
grief in a
friendships.
whole other way. Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely,
Hmm.
absolutely.
So IVF, talk to us a little bit about IVF and that process and why is it so tough for people who don't know?
So, I had looked at some stats before we chatted, and almost 92,000 babies were born via IVF in 22.
Wow.
Yeah, a couple of kids, right? Like IVF is is something that many people use, and not everybody in their lives knows that they utilized fertility support.
Wow.
And part of the challenge is that when a couple is, or a woman, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
there are many single moms by choice, when
Mm-hmm.
they embark in the process of IVF, people get really nosy. Like they just they think that, again, they feel like they have a vote in this, that they have a right to know. And again, well-intentioned but misguided. It's typically under the guise of wanting to be supportive, but it's not helpful. There are so many, and there are different protocols and in different ways that it comes into play. But the bottom line is, for any of my IVF moms, I talk about the fact that IVF is essentially medical trauma.
Mm.
We don't talk about it enough because we focus on the happy goal of pregnancy,
Yeah.
and then the happier goal of a healthy baby.
Mm.
But it's medical trauma. It
Right.
is so invasive, so intrusive.
Mm.
Um, it's also not sexy. There's no spontaneity to IVF, and that is no spontaneity for couples. It becomes very procedure oriented, and it just kind of takes the fun out of it.
Mm.
You're very focused on the end goal, and it can be that can be a whole other grief in and of
Mm.
itself. Um, where people feel like it's this huge vulnerability. They're taking steps to, have this vision of expanding their family.
Mm.
And they just sometimes feel like they are a number in the clinic, right? That they are part of. It just there's a disconnect in general. And so it can be very difficult. And then friends and family, uh, they kind of get to choose who
Mm-hmm.
they want to tell, but part of it is that they often need some support, if they need injections, things like that. And so it becomes a difficult balance. What I say to people is, if you are not needing extra support for fertility, you're not typically telling your friends and coworkers, well, tonight's the night, right? But somehow when it comes to IVF, it's like, oh, well, today I'm going, and then I have to go back, and then I have an ultrasound, and it changes the specialness for couples, because it becomes much more kind of public.
Mm. Wow. Well, thank you for
Yeah,
that explanation.
yeah,
Because sometimes we think we know and we don't know.
no.
To be completely honest with you.
Hmm.
And what you think it's not the whole story, you know.
No.
And I've heard, stories about IVF and how that
Yeah.
affects mothers and couples, and it's not fun. Um,
Well, I mean, there's the hormones that
mhm.
that are being pumped into bodies. The fact that partners are typically the person who is injecting hormones, like it brings a whole different depth to their
Mm.
relationship as
Right.
well. And then there's just so much hurry up and wait, and the process of kind of waiting to see, was this a successful
Mm.
cycle. It takes a toll physically, mentally, and emotionally.
Wow. Wow. That's a lot.
Hmm.
And so when it comes to perinatal loss, um, I know, you know, you speak to couples a
Yeah.
lot, and right. What about the men? Um,
Mm.
in this part, I know the focus is, of course, the mother and the grief, and right, and making sure that they're processing and doing the things. How does a how does a
Oh,
man
dads.
process this?
Yeah. No, I was going to say dads need this too. And here's part of the challenge, that society does a lousy job honoring grief in general.
Hmm.
And society does a lousy job in encouraging boys and men to connect with those quote unquote negative emotions, right? Like things like grief. And so men do have that tendency to go into that mode of, this is about my significant other, right? She's the one who's been through so much.
Mm.
And all of that is true, but it's also that fathers are not immune to what's happening. And so it just almost becomes like a delayed kind of experience, where even the women and mothers can identify the challenges of IVF and the toll it's had on them. Men have a harder time identifying that in real time because, again, they recognize that their partner is the one that's going through the physical experience,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't really connect with the emotional experience of where we've got this vulnerability going through needing any kind of fertility support. And then if, a cycle is not successful, then looking at it through the lens of what does it mean to have a loss that isn't actually a loss. So
Mm.
society, we like to think of loss as being something physical, tangible, right?
Yeah.
Like this idea, particularly with perinatal, is it feels like a less tangible loss. And then when you're looking at IVF, and as you and I had kind of chatted about the idea that IVF falls under the umbrella of perinatal loss, and it's like, but how does it? Particularly if you've never really lost anything per se. And
Right.
so I think because it's not tangible, it is harder for men to really understand what's happening for them. And I
Wow.
think sometimes what dads are able to connect with is cost wise, right? That becomes a piece of how many cycles can we afford to do?
Mm.
And that adds like a whole other layer of complexity with this when couples need to forego future IVF options because financially they're just not in a place to do that. Right. As we talk about that role of provider, and it's like, wow, what does it mean to be a provider who could ultimately provide?
Wow. Wow. A lot of therapy needs to be thrown around in here. It's just, it's no, I mean, it's a lot of different moving parts. It's a lot of
Mhm.
different subcategories in different
So
ways that it
much,
can
so
go,
nuanced,
right.
so nuanced.
It's
Yeah.
it can go in various different directions. And so knowing sometimes what women go through, what men go through, how do people recover together?
Well, I mean, the goal is for them to recover forever or
Yeah.
together forever. But the
Mm-hmm.
bottom line is any loss is an individual like grief experience,
Mm-hmm.
even if it is a shared loss.
Mm.
So a couple goes through the loss of a pregnancy. They have the shared loss, but they have different experiences of it.
Mm.
The example that I offer to people is that if you're in a car and you're driving and the other person is the passenger. I use this example. My mom and my aunt are identical twins. They're fine, but they were in a car accident. So I'm like, identical twins. One was driving, one was the passenger.
Mm.
Same car accident, but given the position that each person is in, there are
Mm-hmm.
different things that they noticed about the accident, right? So there are certain things that will be more prominent for them.
Mm.
So the same is true for a couple who's navigating perinatal loss. It is the same accident, for lack of a better term, but there are different elements that are going to be more prominent for them. And so everybody's experience is true and accurate. You can't necessarily convince somebody to see things from the passenger seat view when they were in the driver's seat.
Mm. That's good. That's good.
It's
Wow.
an example that resonates with people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In in birth trauma, right? I
Mhm.
think a lot of people they understand it and women understand it, but how big of a risk it is, right, for women to already give birth.
Yeah.
They're literally for a lot of them putting their life on the line
Yeah.
each and every time.
Hmm.
And some people are blessed to have kids naturally,
Yep.
and some without even medication.
Hmm.
They just stick it out, right? And a lot of people brag about that, and like kind of makes sometimes some other mothers feel bad. Oh,
Yeah.
right.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. It's not a competition, right? There is no birth experience or method, is better or worse than the other.
Mm,
Right? And it's unfair that we set that up that a vaginal birth unmedicated is somehow better than a vaginal birth with an epidural
Like gold
because
standard.
that's better than a C-section. Yeah, no, and
It's
it's like, nope,
nuts.
that's not how it works.
And there's so many different things that can happen, right, during the course of the pregnancy.
Mhm.
I think it's preeclampsia, if I'm
Yeah,
not saying it, if I'm saying it
no,
correctly.
preeclampsia. Yeah,
Preeclampsia. Yeah, see, I
yeah,
don't know,
you got it.
a little something, a little something.
You've
Uh,
done a great job with this.
there's a lot of different things that can happen right during childbirth, right? That can affect
Absolutely.
the child, that can affect the mother,
Yeah,
both, right? I mean, like in the last episode, Dr. Sarah was talking about, Dr. Shaper was talking about, hemorrhaging and
yeah,
all the things, right?
all the things.
And so many different things can happen that causes birth trauma in and of itself, even if the end result is good. Now, hey, the babies are born, great. Ah,
Yeah,
okay, cool. But along the way, there have been things, and there could be
absolutely.
complications after.
Mhm.
Even if the baby is born healthily, and in which
Yeah.
that's what you want, right? Well, at least you got a healthy baby, and it's just like,
Oh, that's yeah.
thank you
Nope.
for that.
Just
Thank you for
it
that.
that is so dismissive, right?
Hmm.
Everybody's happy that there's a healthy baby. Like it's almost like that doesn't even need to be stated.
Right, right. But here we are, right, and saying things
Yeah.
again, all right? Um, so what does it look like from your bird's eye view of birth trauma, right? How do you help your clients navigate those waters? Because it's not just emotional or mental, it's a lot of it could be physical
Oh,
too,
absolutely.
right? Right, which
Well,
causes, if it's physical, it could cause a lot of things with body shaming and different things going on like that, right? So
mhm,
it's layered in that respect too, mental, emotional, but then my
absolutely.
body. So how do you help
Well,
women?
and I was going to say, I just want to gently offer that we can even expand kind of what people understand birth trauma to be.
Okay. Yeah.
Because right as you're talking about these, these very real things, hemorrhaging, right? Like all kinds of things. And it's like, yes, those are absolutely traumatic, but they're not necessarily likely enough, right? Like we don't want women to be worried about these sorts of things necessarily happening and
Right.
have that be the sole focus. Because the bottom line is that trauma is kind of in the eye of the beholder.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that there is a set standard. And so I kind of use the definition of trauma, something being traumatic is if if it exceeds and doesn't align with what would be the normal and expected experience. So, if you are walking down the street and going to work and you see two cars crash into each other,
Mm.
that didn't impact you directly,
Right.
but it could impact you depending on how bad the accident was. It could
Absolutely.
impact you and be something that is traumatic for you, even though you weren't hurt in it. But it was something that was not aligned with what the expected experience was. So just looking at things like birth trauma and recognizing that someone's partner not being able to get to the hospital on time, right?
Mm.
That can make your birth experience be traumatic.
Ooh. Mm.
We saw
Making
this
me
a lot
think,
with
Doc. Making
we
me
saw
think.
this that's
Yeah.
that's what I always strive to do.
Yeah.
You saw this a lot during COVID, right? That there were all of these factors of if somebody tested positive with COVID before they were going to the hospital, right? Like you had
Mhm.
to test before you delivered. If your partner tested positive, right? Like what did that mean for your partner to be in the delivery room or not be in the delivery room? What did
Ooh.
this mean now when you are laboring, wearing a mask? Like all of these sorts of variables came into play. So even though these were quote unquote straightforward deliveries, right? That
Mm-hmm.
there was no immediate loss of life threat. Babies are fine because we know that matters. But, right, like just the idea that these were birth experiences that had twists and turns. And so I think just being able to honor that somebody may identify that their birth was traumatic, and they're not saying that they had a near miss and almost died. They're not saying that they had this excessive hemorrhage. They're not saying that they had to have surgery to remove the placenta. They are talking about their experience and
Mm,
how they felt.
wow.
And so that like that's part of it, that society has their own judgment. So you can imagine that somebody who gave birth and their partner couldn't be there because the partner had tested positive for COVID, like nobody is necessarily going to buy into the idea that that person had a traumatic birth, right? People are going to
Right.
be like, "Oh my gosh, so you were alone. Do you know how many women have given birth alone?" Right? Like they're going to be dismissive.
Oh, yeah. Or do
Mhm.
you know how many women can't even have kids? And
Right?
that's like
Like,
a guilt.
so all of these things, oh, we love a good dose of guilt. Absolutely. So just like looking at it through the lens of, I always empower moms to recognize their resilience and their adaptability, that we can't control all of the factors that could happen, right? It's not like we can prepare for all of these different scenarios that may
Mm,
happen with your delivery,
mm,
but that I want you to connect with your internal ability
mm.
to adapt. And what I always offer to moms is, if you've navigated pregnancy, you have an internal ability to adapt, because pregnancy is nothing but adapting every damn day.
Wow.
So
Wow.
they've got the ability.
Wow. And making me just my head twirl a little bit just because me I go to the not the extreme but I go to the worst. I'm like, okay, like what are the worst things that can have? Birth trauma,
Hmm.
the worst things that can
Yeah.
happen here,
Oh,
right?
there's
And
some bad things that can happen.
right,
Absolutely.
but not really thinking about, man, like something as simple as my my spouse can't be there.
Hmm.
Wow,
Yeah.
right? That's birth trauma,
Yes.
right? That's something that's so simple, but it's something that can affect people. Um,
Absolutely.
and that's something I would have probably never thought of per se. Um, because it's like, okay, somebody will be there, right? Like a mom or somebody, right? But
Yeah.
it's like, but in this day and age, you got to think about those things. COVID happened,
Hmm. Hmm.
people passed away by themselves, right? And then also
Oh,
had to give birth by
absolutely.
themselves. And
Yeah.
those are things that are traumatic. Um,
Hmm.
Especially if you have a real loving partner and you guys always talked about this moment, right? This
Yeah.
magic moment. Yeah, right.
Right.
Right. And then it's just there is no magic moment. It's we
Hmm.
can't be there.
Yeah.
You have to go through this by yourself, which could be scary, especially if it's your
Absolutely.
first birth. Um,
Absolutely.
and now it's like I have to go through this by myself and
Yeah.
nobody's here. Wow.
Hmm.
That yeah. Yeah,
Hmm.
that took me for a little loop there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Took me on a journey.
Yeah.
Hmm. It's the simple things in life we forget,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And that's something that was reminded of that reminded me of that, where it was something so simple,
Hmm.
but not really, right?
Right.
And they always say small problems could end up being big problems,
Hmm.
snowballs into something huge. And so something like that, I can see it now, right? And so yeah, thank you for that. Um, so when it comes to birth trauma though, how do you help your clients kind of get through? Like, of course, it depends on what it is, um,
Sure.
but just generically, like, how do you help these parents get through birth trauma? Different than perinatal loss, but like birth
Hmm.
trauma. How do you
Hmm.
help these couples, mother, father, um, kind of get through these hurdles?
So one of the things that I had heard about fairly recently is, I spoke with somebody who said that their healthcare team, when they delivered, They had a birth that had some twists and turns. And they said that after they delivered, that their doctor and nurse separately came over and said, your birth was not what you expected, and you are okay. But I want you to know that that was a scary experience.
Mm,
And so they validated that's what we call trauma informed care.
mm,
That is more impactful than anything that a therapist can do, right? So let's talk about that. That if we can get within the healthcare system and awareness of what it is to provide trauma informed care, that's going to save people from having traumatic birth experiences.
wow.
So yeah, no, and I was thrilled, right, that she had had that experience where somebody honored what had happened and did not say all's well that ends well, the baby's fine, and look, you'll be fine too. So I think the other piece of this is then when people are coming to therapy, and I think it's important that because trauma is kind of in the eye of the proverbial beholder,
Hmm.
what may be traumatic for a mother or a birthing person may or may not be traumatic for the partner.
Mm,
So there have been dads who have been a little alarmed at the amount of blood. Like women are used to associating blood with their bodies, particularly with their reproductive organs.
yeah.
So we have at least some semblance with that. Men don't really have any familiarity with that for the most
Panic.
part.
Go
And
time.
so, right? So there are men who are just like astounded by the amount of blood in and of itself. Even again, if this is a straightforward, like there's nothing threatening, there's nothing
Mhm.
complicated. So we need to leave room to honor that because people have a tendency, right? I feel like it's whatever the joke in movies about men getting lightheaded and passing out in the delivery room, right? We make a big joke about it, but
Phew.
the bottom line is like men don't have a frame of reference. They attend the childbirth class and get a little bit of a frame of reference. Watching something on a screen, a movie, for lack of a better term, is very different
Right.
from watching somebody that you love and adore
Hmm.
lose that much blood, right? Like I can see that much blood on the screen. It's different from being there live and in person and
Yes.
seeing that blood come out of the person that I love.
Yes.
So we just have to leave room for that. Sometimes there's a different experience. So traumatic birth, everybody's fine ultimately. Like I'll skip to the happy ending, everybody's fine, but baby needs to get to the NICU. So there are dads who are like, do I stay with my wife or girlfriend who's
Hmm.
now being stitched up, having whatever experience, or do I go and follow the team with this baby? Who
Mm,
do I choose right now, right? We're talking
mm.
about this idea of the provider. I've got to provide now for an extra person and all of that. And now it's like this horrible choice. What do you do? Now, for a mom, it's easy. Go, 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 go with that baby. That's what you
Yep.
tell the dads to do. Go, go, go. But dads don't like, they are like, oh my gosh, I just watched the woman that I love go through this horrible experience.
Yes.
So, and that's traumatic for them.
Hmm.
And we need to be able to talk about that and leave space for dads to have their own experiences
Mm.
that can be traumatic.
Wow.
So, shout out to the dads.
Yeah. Shout out to the
Yeah.
dads. Yeah, for sure. Because you're right. I think it is different. Because I like watching medical shows. Like back in the day, I used to watch a show called ER. That's like
Oh, yeah.
dating
Oh,
myself
listen,
back in the day.
back in
Um,
whose day?
no, that was back in my day. That was, that's when I was like, oh, mom, I
Oh,
want to be a surgeon. She goes, oh yeah, okay,
oh, yeah.
we'll see in like a couple of years, right? Yeah. Yeah. And then I started to watch more and more medical shows, and there's always been in each one of those shows. And now thinking about it now from this lens,
Yeah.
there's always been an episode where a father has to pick and choose who they save, the child or the mother.
Hmm.
And it always blew my mind how are you faced with that decision?
Mhm.
Either way you go, you're gonna have trauma after that,
Oh my
right?
gosh, yeah.
Like it's either you're gonna have perinatal,
Hmm.
right? Which then I didn't know what that was, or you're gonna have just loss of your
Absolutely.
person. And but it's interesting when they did polls like on men and what they would choose, mostly
Yep.
the partner.
Yeah.
And that, but then when you poll the women, it's
Oh,
mostly don't save me, save the child.
absolutely.
But a man's like, I don't want to raise a child without you.
And
It's so
it's funny,
it's so
like it's a different, I know. And I think it speaks to the idea that when a woman has a positive pregnancy test, she becomes a mother. It's just that different connection.
mm,
And so, but being able to leave room for the fact that it's like what a horrible place to be as a man, right? Where you're like, oh my gosh, you should never have to make the choice.
no,
And that idea of feeling like I'm not sure, it's right, like a squirrel in the road, right? Like which way do I go? Um, it's such a difficult place.
it's a
And so
difficult place because for men, it's like, how do I say this sensitively? A man sometimes, I won't say 100% of the time, obviously, but we can try again to make a
uh,
baby, right?
absolutely.
But
No,
I
that's a
cannot
no,
get
that's so
another
common.
you. Like
Absolutely. That is so
I,
common.
that
Yeah,
is I, how do it's just and it's like you don't mean to say that insensitively, right? But
yeah, no, no, no.
it's like a real feeling like, I don't want to do life without you. And not that I want to do life without this child, but we can try to make another one, hopefully. We can
Absolutely.
adopt. How about
Yeah,
that? Right? We can try,
yeah.
we can try different things. But no matter what happens, if I don't choose you, I lose you. Like,
No,
and then
yeah.
you, yes, and now I have a baby. I look just like you.
Hmm.
Oh, hell
Yeah.
no. Like that,
Nope, I know.
that's a thing where you have to, and you're put in these positions, right? Where it's
Hmm.
sometimes that, and that's what I'm saying. Childbirth it's not easy. And and sometimes you walk into it thinking, oh, mm, right. And then it's like, wait, whoa, one day it was great. Now we're here.
Hmm.
What do you do? Right. And I never, man, I never want to, God forbid. But it's just one of those things where it's an impossible decision. It's an impossible decision. And
Yeah,
it's a bad place for, anyone to be in, but for a
absolutely.
man to be in that position, I would just me. As honest as I try to be. I would tell my person, my girlfriend, hey, don't ask me. I'm telling you what the choice is right now. Before we even get there, before anything happens, I'm having a tough conversation with you right now.
Yep.
If I ever have to make a choice, I'm telling you right now, I don't care. I'm not going to give you fluff. You may not like it.
Yeah.
We anticipate everything to go absolutely 2000% the way it's supposed to.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't, and if
Mhm.
Terrence has to make a tough decision, I'm telling you before anything bad, I'm telling you
Yeah.
what the decision is going to be.
No. Yeah.
That's how I would have to approach that
Hmm.
before it's thrown at me, and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh God, like what I'm telling
I
and
know.
then you wake up like, what did you do? I told you 3 days ago what I was going to do.
No. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That would probably have to
And
be my conversation. As
though you're right that that is the typical response that comes into play for men. And
yeah,
doesn't it align with the problem solving kind of tendency, right? The idea of we can have another. I can fix
it
this.
it does.
Yeah.
It does, and it doesn't. Now, unfortunately, we're gonna have to go through the perinatal loss. Now, the problem with that is now the woman might look at the man in a different light.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, and that's what I was going to say is right. Like the impact on relationships. And so that's such a key part. In general, after perinatal loss, the default mode is that moms will seek support and dads don't. And so, again, it speaks to the idea of an unspeakable loss and the experience of somebody who has truly not been supported in being able to speak of any loss, right? We expect that boys and men are just going to be quote unquote tougher. And then that lens of who really endured the loss, the default mode is that the mom did. And so there was such a gap in support for men. And there are support groups, there's definitely more recognition. Part of the challenge is that having more resources available, there's still the gap of men actually accessing the resources,
Mm.
right? There's still that stigma piece.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Um, I know you have to get out of here, so I'm just gonna ask you, as I always do,
Yeah.
um, talk to the couples out there. No, you know what? Let's do it like this. Talk to the women out there
Okay.
that's actually have that has gone through this, perinatal loss, birth trauma. I don't know, give them some encouraging Jane Johnson
Mm,
Wall gems, as
mm.
only you could.
Oh, feel the pressure. Um, the bottom line is if you have navigated perinatal loss, if you have had a traumatic birth, your experience of your experience is all that matters. You need to honor that for yourself, and you need to find the people who will support honoring that experience for you. And so sometimes that's the friends and family that you have available. Sometimes that is a therapist. Sometimes that is community of support groups. But the bottom line is just because it wasn't this bad, just because that horrific thing didn't happen, just because there's a positive outcome in whatever sort of way, that doesn't dismiss what your actual experience has been. And we want to make sure that you have support and kind of shining some light on a dark time in your life.
Mm, wonderful. And the second part to that, can't forget about the fellas now.
We cannot. No, society has forgotten about the dads. And to the dads, I would say, and let's phrase it accordingly. If your wife or partner has experienced perinatal loss or birth trauma, that is tragic. And her experience doesn't dictate your experience. And so the same thing of your experience is what matters. And whatever her experience has been and whatever the loss was, your inclination is to want to support her. And that's what makes
Hmm.
you a great partner. The best thing that you can do in supporting her is make sure
Mm.
you have the support that's going to help you be able to do that. With grief, we want to think marathon, not sprint. You're in it for the long haul. There is ebb, there is flow. Grief is complex. So, for the dads, the best thing that you can do is get support for yourself so that you can be that rock for her that I know you want to be.
I love that. And there's no better place and time than to stop right there. Um, you are a gem,
Oh,
God
thank
sent
you.
gem. And you are licensed in many states.
Yes.
If anybody needs a good one, check out the states that she's licensed in and see. I don't know how she gets.
Well,
I don't know if she has room. She may not have
I've
room.
got it.
She may not have
Well,
room.
I was going to say, so with the MotherLoad Collective,
Hmm.
Kelsey and I have a free resource, and we're adding some other ones, but we have a free download that is for parents who are navigating and preparing for perinatal loss and kind of talking about what are the things that you can do to advocate for yourself, right? Like, what are the things that you can ask for? How can you seek support from your family? So we have things available that kind of help support families. We have a self-regulation workshop that is focused on lost moms, and it's also the lost dads are utilizing it as well. Like, it's
Love that.
important to recognize that there are resources available because there are people who understand the nuances. There are people who understand that they'll never truly understand what your experience has been. And that's part of the challenge. So, yes, I've got the individual therapy piece in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Florida, and California. And then with the MotherLoad Collective, we have a lot of resources to be able to support families who are navigating this and other things, that just the
Hmm.
general parenting things as well.
Absolutely. Big shout out to the MotherLoad Collective and Kelsey. Hello.
Kelsey Mizell, yeah, she's the best.
Doing
She's the
amazing
best.
things as well. But thank you again for coming on the show. Thank
Thank
you
you for having
for
me.
this amazing conversation surrounding perinatal loss and birth trauma. It's necessary that these things are highlighted. You gave so much knowledge, so thank you very much
My
for coming on
pleasure.
the show. And of course, all the links will be right here at the bottom, right there for you to check out the MotherLoad Collective, your mom pod. I mean, everything that is Jane Johnson Wall. You will be able to connect with her in any way that you'd like. And again, has been another episode of Conversations of the Heart. Again, it's your boy T Till, Jane Johnson Wall here as a featured guest, family to the show now. Um,
Thank you.
appreciate you, and we'll see you guys next week. Peace.